Lots of numbers. The White House targeting the deficit, trying to reduce it by $1.1 trillion over 10 years. But will that be enough? Let's bring in our political panel now. Ron Bonjean, former communications director to House Speaker Dennis Hastert, and Alexandra Acker-Lyons, Democratic strategist. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, Heather.
So, Alexandra, let's begin with you. Look at these numbers. The national debt, it was $10.6 trillion when Obama took office. Today, it's $14.1 trillion. This budget proposal would reduce projected deficits by $1.1 trillion. Is that enough?
Look, I think we're looking at still continuing hard economic times as the economy continues to improve and tax revenues go up. The deficit has been going down over the last year. This proposal by President Obama is a good starting point. Democrats are putting their cards on the table. I think it's time for Republicans to do the same. This ongoing Republican civil war in the Republican conference in the House is certainly going to play out over this, which is seen as the battle to the Tea Party activists. I think some of the draconian cuts that Republicans are proposing are going to be very unpopular with Americans. And really, you can't talk about budgets unless you talk about things like entitlement reform, cutting defense spending, and tax reform.
And Ron, in December, though, there was a bipartisan majority of his fiscal commission, Obama's fiscal commission. They proposed saving $4 trillion over a decade. This falls way short of that.
Yeah, it sure does. President Obama said basically he's not going to listen to that commission. He just basically tossed aside their recommendations of $4 trillion worth of deficit cutting. And what he's really doing is not even putting a dent in reducing the deficit. What he's doing is taxing too much, spending too much, and borrowing too much once again. He's proposing freezes on spending. Right now, over the last couple of years, he's proposed trillions of dollars of new spending, and now he's saying, well, I'm going to cut a little bit here and a little bit there, and we're going to freeze the rest. And that's just not going to work. Republicans were elected to cut spending, and that's what they're doing.
Alexandra, speaking of cutting spending, we heard Steve mention this. 2/3 of the reductions coming from cuts in spending include many domestic programs that the president supports himself: airport grants, water treatment, public health programs, forestry programs. Is domestic spending, though, in your opinion, the problem?
Not at all. And some of these cuts are to incredibly successful programs like Pell Grants and Head Start, things that have been proven to work and help lower income Americans achieve the American dream. As I said, the real problem here is entitlement reform, defense spending, and tax reform. And until Democrats and Republicans are willing to seriously come to the table in a bipartisan way and work on these key issues, we're going to continue to see the budget just tossed around like a political football.
Ron, let's talk about those entitlement programs. The president would reduce military spending, some health care costs, but neither party, actually neither one, tackling the unsustainable long-term growth of entitlement programs like Medicare. Why is that?
Right. Entitlement reform needs to be addressed, and it should be addressed. And the president has a chance to take the lead tomorrow. Doesn't look like he's going to get to it. And, getting back on the discretionary spending cuts, these domestic spending cuts, right now these programs were inflated over the last couple of years by millions and billions of dollars. So when you hear the Democrats saying that these programs are getting drastically cut, no, not necessarily. These programs had huge amounts of increases, and now and in fact, there is over $1 trillion in the current budget that could be in unobligated spending, which means money left on the table. They haven't even figured out how to spend. So I think there's some low-hanging fruit here that could get to. But you're right, entitlement reform is really important, and both parties are going to have to come together at some point to figure it out.
Alexandra, the president also would extend the Bush tax cuts, but not for people whose taxable income is more than $250,000 a year. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, let's remember that the Bush tax cuts account for 66% of this deficit. To me, that's just unconscionable. I was unhappy with the deal that extended the Bush tax cuts for people making over $250,000, a couple of months ago. I'm certainly against making it permanent. And I think that in a time of recession, trying to say, let's cut programs that are helping the vast majority of Americans, 90% of Americans who are in some some way reaping the benefit of these programs while saying to the rich, we're going to continue to let you have 66% of our deficit go into your pocket. I think it's just completely irresponsible.
Ron, you get the final word here as we wrap up. What message is this sending to the American people?
Yeah, what it says that the president is not willing to give small businesses the certainty that it needs to keep hiring more people because businesses usually make $250,000 or more, and that's what's going to hit. So giving certainty to those businesses are so important these days, and that's exactly where we need to go.
So we gave both of you the final word there. How's that? Thank you very much for joining us, Ron Bonjean and Alexandra Acker-Lyons.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Heather.
Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
All right, some brand new developments to tell you about in Egypt. The military leaders ruling the country setting out a plan now for transition to civilian government. Those moves meeting some of the demands